This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. It's a series of video interviews with people who have impacted Nebraska broadcasting for decades. Once again today, we are at the studios of UNO Television in Omaha. I'm Neil Nelkin for the NBA. An important component of radio broadcasting has always been radio news. It represents an important information source and an impartial connection to the communities that we serve as broadcasters. To remain in a position of leadership in radio news for decades is rare and unique. And our guest on today's interview has done just that. Please welcome from Alpha Media's KFOR in Lincoln, Dale Johnson.
Neil, it's very nice being here today. Thank you.
Welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about you and how you came to be where you are today, your history and the people who have influenced you over the years and the people that you have influenced over the years. We might mention that we've talked for about an hour prior to taping, so hopefully this won't sound rehearsed and we want to make it as spontaneous as possible. Dale, let's start at the beginning. How did you start in this business that we are in?
It started in Holdridge, my hometown, at KUVR. I was as a listener. They ran a contest, guest DJ type show. You would call, they would play a short snippet of a song, you would call, and if you won, you walked in and picked up a fistful of worthless 45s at the time. All right, I would win that contest so much that they put me on a list you could only win once a week, all right? So this was when I was in high school. Graduated in '74, went on to school. At the time, I wanted to become an architect. So I went to tech school, it's now community college, and I wanted to get a degree in drafting, then ultimately become an architect. As the tour guide was giving us a tour of the facility, here's the accounting department, boring. Here's the campus radio station. Very cool. Never made it to the drafting side of the building. I look in this window and there are young people playing rock and roll in t-shirts and shorts. I said, I can do that. So I changed my interest from being a listener to actively getting involved. So I signed up for radio. And at the time you needed a third class ticket. You can relate to that. FCC license at the time to be able to read antenna lights and take meter readings every so often. So you had to go to school to get it. Got my third class ticket, bolted, went back to KUVR, was working there nights and weekends while getting my third class, got it, and they hired me full time. Was working nights at KUVR.
Who hired you?
Bill Whitlock was the owner, manager of KUVR.
In the little brick building in downtown Holdridge.
Still there, on Main Street, 4th Avenue. And Bill smoked cigars as big as your thumb, and you could smell him before you could see him. And a wonderful guy, didn't relate much to me as on air. He focused primarily on sales, as a lot of managers did and still do. So my interaction with Bill was minimal. Especially since working at nights. That after I got my third class ticket, I was hired daytime, and so one of the shows I would host would be a trading post show. Every radio station has.
Every small market station has done it.
Tradio, trading post, you call it by different names. People call in, they list garage sales and things they want to, swap shop. So I'm sitting in the control room doing the show, and a story I remember from Bill is he loved to tell jokes, usually Irish jokes, and often off color. Politically incorrect now, then certainly now. And he would walk in and he'd have his cigar in his mouth and he would sit down and he wouldn't give us a signal, but I knew he wanted to talk. So he would sit down and he would sit there and I would open up his mic and he would tell an off-colored Irish joke and laugh at it, and then he would get up and leave.
On the air?
On the air. And that was my interaction with Bill Whitlock. Wonderful man, took a chance on me, a kid. I'm 18, 19 years old at the time, got my third class ticket, and I'm right where I want to be.
You're in big time show business.
KUVR in Holdridge.
AM only at the time,
At
right?
the time, yeah. Learned a lot. That's where I really went to school because here's a story that I didn't relate earlier when you and I chatted. There is a point where I am doing play-by-play of a parade. It's the Oxford Turkey Day Parade, and it's hot. And I am doing play-by-play of a parade on radio. And I'm thinking to myself, how is this going to be relatable in my career? Fast forward, there's a point where I'm covering a fire and a tornado, separate issues, but on spot news. And I start describing color. I start describing what I smell, what I don't smell, what I see, what I don't see, what has just happened, what is going to happen. And I think back to that Turkey Day parade. That's exactly what I was doing at that parade, describing color, motion, what I see, what I don't see, the crowd, describing things, painting a picture on radio. That's what I was doing at these tornado events and these spot news events. So KUVR served me very early on in being able to be relatable in news.
And the parade proved valuable to you.
Yes.
And probably still does today.
And they aired it once live, recorded it, and played it back and sold it separately later on that day. Ran it twice. That's small market radio.
That's Bill Whitlock. Absolutely.
Make money twice.
And you got paid twice, right?
No. You get paid for one parade.
Where did you land after KUVR Holdridge?
Got married in '76 and moved to Kearney, KRNY. And for anyone who has seen the television show WKRP, that was KRNY. Freedom. Freedom and with no accountability. But we were smart enough to know how far to push the envelope. Dick Ressler was the manager. Alan Breck was doing the morning show with Fishman. Fishman was a guy who had an aquarium business in Kearney, and he was from New York, and he had the accent, and he was funny, and he would say anything, didn't really care.
He was a character.
He was a character, and so the morning show was Motown. Al liked Motown, so any music they played was Motown. So here I come on at 9 o'clock, and I'm the rock and roll guy. So I bring on long play versions of Derek and the Dominoes' Layla, and long versions of Boston at 9 in the morning, and just loving it. Doing interviews, making phone calls, doing things just short of getting us kicked off the air. The guy that comes on after me is a Southern country Western fan. So now we go from rock and roll to Charlie Daniels to Marshall Tucker. And it worked. The format worked. And we were high above the ABC Rexall Drug Building at 24th and Central Avenue in downtown Kearney. Still
And you've had
remember the ID.
a lot of response from listeners?
We did. It was a college town, still is. And we were young. We related to the college town. KRNY was the KFRX. Those people viewing know KFRX in Lincoln is relatable to the University of Nebraska. And KRNY was relatable to the students of Kearney State at that time.
Almost free form.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
I'll bet the people at KGFW thought highly of it.
They wondered, ratings didn't matter. I don't believe we ever paid for a Nielsen. Obviously too expensive. We really didn't care, just so we were bringing in some revenue, enough to pay the bills and keep the lights on.
And how much sales did go on at the old KRNY?
Not as much as I would have liked. There was a practice called trade out. And trade out is, I walk into a store and I buy a car, and instead of exchanging money, I'm going to give you the value of the car in commercials. All right, so no money changes hands. Well, that's revenue not coming in. Yeah, we've got a car, but we're not paying the bills. And this was happening more and more peripherally outside of the radio station, okay? So we weren't seeing a lot of revenue. There was a point later on at KRNY where I actually watched them repossess the copy machine.
In the radio station?
In the radio station. Unplug it, roll it out of the radio station because we couldn't pay the bill.
WKRP.
But it was fun. It was so much fun.
And you learned a lot.
I learned a lot. And then I moved to Omaha. My wife was accepted at the pharmacy college. Moved to Omaha, got a job at KFAB, and that's That's really where it became a business, because it was a much larger market, more discipline, more accountability, and
What year was this when you went to KFAB?
oh, that would have been 79. Would have been 79, spent 3 years there, so 79 to 82.
Who were
And
the
I'm-
people there that you came upon when you first moved into the market?
Neil, the list is so long, and the names are so familiar to people in Omaha. Again, this is a 23-year-old kid. Walk in, Walt Kavanaugh, Di Sago, Tom Johnson, Kent Pavelka, Lyle Bremser, Ken Hedrick, Don Cole, the old redhead. Don Cole was the morning guy on the morning show. And I just kept my mouth shut and my ears open, and I spent 3 years going to school at KFAB. Walt Kavanaugh had forgotten more about radio than I had lived it up to that time.
For those who don't know, Walt Kavanaugh, longtime KFAB news director.
And Di Sago, I can still hear Di's voice. What a great female voice in a career, in a profession where there were so few females, and she was so strong. And Tom Johnson, who still has a great voice, not the best of health at the moment, but he went on then to run the Nebraska lottery system out of Lincoln. Of course, everyone knows Lyle Bremser. Lyle was, at the time, KGOR, which is now an institution in this area. I was there when they were first tweaking it and getting it onto the air. They had a piece of equipment, and you know this, you've been in the business as long as I have. They're called carousels, and they are literally carousels, 24 trays where the computer, you load them with carts.
Remember carts?
And then they extract, rotate, and then insert. And the computer just runs these. And there were probably 12 of these.
And your commercials were on these tape cartridges.
And so it's not unusual to see 4 or 5 or 6 of these carousels all rotating at the same time, loading different carts, because in carousel number 1, tray 15 is a commercial. Carousel 7, tray 12 is another commercial. So it's rotating, and everything's rotating so that it plays as smooth as possible. In one of those trays, I forgot a newscast.
Automated newscast.
Automated newscast that aired every hour. And this came at a time when Lyle Bremser was overseeing KGOR. And I came in the next morning, I'm the morning guy, anchoring with Tom Mickelson. And Scott Cannon is the afternoon guy, so there are 3 of us running KGOR. And I knew that I had forgotten this news, and I knew that Lyle in some way would bring it to my attention. The control room sat with the studio door behind us, so I'm running the board and I hear the door open and I turn around and it's Lyle. Hello, Mr. Bremser. He walks in, doesn't fully enter the room, just stands there with the door open, and he says, "You get 2, that's 1. And then he turned around and walked out and never mentioned it again. Never brought it to my attention again. And I'm so honored by that, because he had enough respect for me. He knew that I knew what we were talking about. No need to bring it up again. Knew that I wasn't going to do it again. I knew that I made the mistake.
Did it ever happen again?
No, it never happened again. No.
Message delivered.
So it never was. We never reached number 2.
What about the times that you were at KFAB, 3 years at this juncture? What else did you learn there? You hadn't yet decided to make news your career.
No, as a matter of fact, I was on from 3 to 5. I did sportscasts at 20 past the hour, 3:20, 4:20 for Saddlemeyer. Gary Saddlemeyer was there doing afternoons.
And at the time, KFAB played music.
We played music, strict list, strict clock.
No deviation.
No, and Gary was and still is such a wonderful man, just so tolerant of, again, this 23-year-old kid in on an institution radio station. I'm a newbie coming in from outside the market. So
50,000 watt heritage radio station, good neighbor to a great neighbor
to the Midwest.
To the Midwest.
Ratings, double-digit ratings that are unheard of these days. So I go on at 7. I do the 2 hours, the 2 sportscasts. And then I'm on from 7 to midnight, and I'm doing this Wednesdays through Sundays. So I'm working every weekend, every night, and Monday and Tuesday are my days off. And I want better hours than this. So Ken Hedrick, the general manager, always encouraged us, if we were wanting to branch out and were interested in other facets of radio, to bring it to his attention. I said, I'd like to try news.
Why news?
I do sports. The hours, only for the hours. It was a selfish reason. It was because I could work an 8 to 5, generally speaking. So he started me off with a few hours. I was still doing a board shift, and gradually I worked into doing more and more news and got consistent hours. And I loved it. Don't know if I was any good at it. I just mirrored what Walt was doing, what Tom and Di were doing, and they were doing it well. So what better product to emulate than a product that's serving the station well? And so I would monitor city council, the usual events, cover some news, do the cop beat, and become experienced with speaking to news people. But it was for the hours, Neil. It was for some consistent hours. Isn't that a selfish reason? But it worked, because eventually I became good enough at news to apply back to KRNY in Kearney, to be the big fish in the little ocean, thinking that I could make a difference.
I've been at KFAB.
You betcha. I left the place in shambles. I'm going to come back and we're going to say, it hadn't changed. Things were still the same, and I was disillusioned very quickly. Was there for 3 months, and lucky enough to have a newscast heard by Jay Vavracek,
Who was?
the manager at KRGI.
In Grand Island.
In Grand Island. So he was on his way from Grand Island to North Platte, heard me, called back to his ops guy and said, let's try to get this news guy from KRNY hired at KRGI in Grand Island. We need a news director. So I lasted 3 months at KRNY the second time. Thank goodness. I was so anxious to leave, but I was still living out of boxes. My wife and I were still in boxes. We had just moved.
She must have loved it.
She didn't. She, bless her heart, she was along for the ride and welcomed it. But and so we moved to Grand Island, and Jay Vavracek loved working for Jay. We were very relatable, but approximately the same age at the time, back in, would have been 82, 2 years after the tornado. June 80 tornado wiped out a lot of Grand Island in one part of town. And so I was there 2 years later, and Jay was a very involved manager. He sponsored softball teams, bowling leagues, got involved with, very relatable to his employees, had a great time. Brian Gallagher, who is still in Grand Island doing play-by-play, he and I did mornings and just clicked it right away. Had a wonderful time on the air with Brian doing mornings, and was the news director.
KRGI was the Stewart station then?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Under the tutelage and management of one Mr. Dick Chapin.
Mr. Chapin. To this day, he is still Mr. Chapin. If Mr. Chapin walked into the room, it would be Mr. Chapin.
And he would expect nothing less.
Yes, and he and I had something that clicked. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and that was to be able to do what I do in Grand Island at a higher level in a bigger market. So I was at Grand Island for 3 years. There was a point where KFOR in Lincoln needed a news director, needed some change. And so he asked me, the way Dick Chapin asks people, we're going to move you to Lincoln. And so he wanted me to start as news director at KFOR in Lincoln.
Now, you told me you first visited with the then general manager of KFOR, Roger Larson, and how'd that interview go?
We met at the Village Inn in York. And again, I'm still thinking I'm a big fish in a little ocean, and they asked me, so really all the cards are in my hand. So I'm thinking pretty highly of myself, and I've prepped this conversation, and so I walk in, and Roger says, we're anxious to have you. What do you think of starting at KFOR? And I rattled off a salary, or I made some indication that I'd be coming for higher pay than Grand Island, and he just stopped me in mid-sentence and he said, we're going to pay you what you're making now. Okay. Do you want me to pay for the pie?
No negotiation.
No discussion. It wasn't mean. It wasn't, he wasn't in my face. He was just this is the way it's going to be. You're going to have to prove yourself. And so I knew right then at that conversation, Neil, I mean, I respected him for that. I was disappointed, but I learned so much just by him in that short exchange at the Village Inn in York.
So already you've crossed paths with some pretty substantial legends in this business in this state, with Jay Vavrichek and Roger Larson and Dick Chapin, and now you're in Lincoln. And what's your first impression of KFOR?
I want to draw again on what you've just said. The names of the people that I have worked with in this business are just giants in Nebraska broadcasting. And I am just so privileged to have learned and sponged off of all of these people, because I have a little bit of Walt, a little bit of Di, a little bit of Roger, a little bit of Kent, a little bit of Gary in things that I do every day. And I'm a mosaic of all of these people that I have been privileged to work with over these years. So I start January 1st. I moved the week between Christmas and New Year's. Wouldn't recommend that, moving between Christmas and New Year's. So I start January 1 at KFOR, and we have Scott Young and Kathy Blythe. We have Morning show. We have Larry Molenbrink, who went on to be involved in Husker basketball and Husker football. Just a booming voice, just a great, hardworking, talented man. We have Greg Jackson, who has been in the Lincoln market for quite some time, and again, one of these baritone type voices. Chuck Stevens, who's in the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Sports guy, sports director. And so I'm working with these legends now at KFOR.
And you're also in a legendary location at this point.
The 8th floor of the Stewart Building, downtown, which is now the Rococo.
Right.
And condos, I think.
But it was a pretty classical location for radio stations. Had been there forever.
The energy downtown at that time, this would have been 1985. Lincoln is fewer than 200,000 people and growing. And we're downtown in the heart of it. We could walk to events. We generated a show with Scott and Kathy called Lincoln Live, which is still on the air today. I do Lincoln Live now, and it was a live show from the restaurant at the Cornhusker Hotel. And they would walk there every afternoon, set up shop, do a half-hour live show from 12:30 to 1, pulling in guests from people who were staying there and people who were eating at the cafeteria. And it was all live at that point. And we were capable of doing that because of our location, downtown. But again, it was the energy of downtown that was so exciting.
And the radio station drew off of that energy.
We did, and we were identified by that. The other radio station at the time, KLAN is still on O Street, about 40th and O, and classic facility, classic broadcast house. But we were downtown, and there were I believe Channel 6 was in the building, would do a Lincoln Bureau shot from across the street, and some of the other Omaha television stations had bureaus at that time in Lincoln. But we were the only radio station at that time downtown. KFRX was our FM at the time, and they were on a different floor, but we were both in the Stewart Building.
Must have been interesting on home football Saturdays, being right downtown on the way to the stadium.
I had a parking spot. I always had a parking spot downtown. It was great. It didn't matter if it was a non-football game or a football game. I always had my little spot that I could park.
How long were you at KFOR at that time? You came in, and how long did it take you to realize where you were and what you were doing?
And I have to think about that, Neil, because so many people have gone. Probably when Larry Molenbrink left. Because when Larry left to work, I believe he's in New Mexico radio right now. Went to Kansas City and worked for a while.
Right.
Then went on to New Mexico. When Larry left, a big part of the station changed. Larry was there long before I was, and Larry had gotten to know so many people in the community. And to have reaction to Larry's departure showed me what kind of high cotton I was in, and made me realize that this is a very special place, and especially with Roger Larson there, doing what Roger did, generating revenue, having a sales staff with Vince Kalura, Gay Cole, and I'm leaving out names, but those are the two that come to the top. Because they, as other people did, they treated me, I'm a kid. Again, I'm a kid. I'm coming here, I'm 29, 30 years of age. with Chuck Stevens, who's been there a while, Scott, who's extremely talented, Kathy, who moved from, at a time when women in this business was unheard of, she was making a name for herself as a co-host with Scott. And Kathy, of course, is a two-time Marconi winner and a member of the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame.
And still does the show.
Still does Problems and Solutions. She's on her 25th year.
That's unheard of as well. I asked you earlier, with all the people that you ran across in Lincoln, being a part of that community, particularly the political people, who was your favorite Nebraska governor?
And I answered that quickly. It was Bob Kerrey. Bob Kerrey had an edge to him. Good-looking, dark-haired, charismatic guy, relatable to the media.
Dated a movie star.
Dated Deborah Winger while she was in Lincoln filming Terms of Endearment. And I really enjoyed covering him. At the time, I was a news director that would go out to events. Don't do so much of that anymore. Got a talented staff that can do that for me. But I would go to governors' news conferences, gubernatorial events, and I always watched his charisma. He could control a room without being demonstrative.
And he was a Democrat, for those who don't remember.
But just a good-looking guy that just
Young Nebraska
confident.
product.
Yeah.
Congressional Award winner, businessman.
Successful businessman in the restaurant business and other endeavors. And at the time seemed like all he had to do was just pick something and he could accomplish it.
Then he ran for president. Remember that downtown when he announced.
He announced, and you and I were recalling the Australian song that
Waltzing Matilda.
and he wanted everyone to sing it, and we're all wondering why. There's a military reference to it. It's a more somber song than what we might think.
Right.
And at the time, people were wondering, and he did explain it, but he announced that he was running for president. Lasted a couple of primaries, if I remember right.
That was on Centennial Mall, right downtown Lincoln.
Right. And the
What a
writing was on the wall after a couple of primaries, and
Yeah, he and Bill Clinton got into some issues,
yeah.
and Bill Clinton went on, as we know, and Bob didn't. You also hosted the Nebraska Broadcasters Association monthly Governor's Call-In Show.
Yeah.
And as host of that, you were there for the event.
This is pre-delay time. There were no delays then.
There was no digital.
No. It had to be a mechanical delay if there was any at all, and we didn't have one. There was no need for one. Tom Osborne would come in and do his post-game show, not post-game, but would do his statewide call-in show. And Tom's not going to swear at all or even
Maybe a
scan at
dadgummit.
all. Dadgummit would be the most he'd ever utter. So there was no need for a delay. And we're doing a statewide call-in, so you tell me 30 some odd stations?
35 radio stations across Nebraska.
Across the entire state.
Live.
We had no delay, all right? And we have an hour-long call-in show, and we're about 15 minutes into it. Guy calls in early, stays on hold. Hi, you're on the air with Governor Kerrey. What's your question? I can still hear this. Governor, how you doing? Good. Got just one question. Are you still Deborah Winger? And
Live on 35 stations.
live on 35 stations. And the room got about 150 degrees, and you can hear on the tape me swallowing. Go. Pulling down my Adam's apple. And I look at the engineer shakes his head.
Who was the engineer? You missed it.
Greg Jackson.
Greg Jackson.
Was the engineer. Bob looks at me, I shake my head, and I said, and it seems like I took forever to think of something to say. Would you please stick to the subject? Tonight we're talking about LB. It was a legislative bill at the time. And the next morning I got phone calls from the Dallas newspaper. I got this is pre-internet, so people couldn't send me anything, but I, in the mail, got newspaper clippings from all over the country, asked for interviews. Bob's security, a state patrol officer, was in Rogers' office at the time. I could hear and they're running down the hallway, and they run into the engineering office, and we wrote down the names of everybody that called, their phone numbers and the addresses. Of course, that was bogus. And they followed it up later, and it was a phone booth somewhere. To my knowledge, they never found out who this was. But that is my claim to fame, so to speak, one of them anyway.
Did you ever bring it up with Bob after that?
Years later, we did an interview, and at the end of the interview, Bob said, well, that one went better than the last time we talked. And we've mentioned it in a little innuendo form ever since, but that's a little relatable fact that only Bob and I have.
But there are numerous copies of the tape.
I'm sure there are copies
everywhere,
all over the place.
You had also mentioned that KFOR was the big dog in the building, and then along came this little other station, KFRX, and another legendary Nebraska broadcaster who was featured on that station was Sonny Valentine.
Sonny programmed it.
Again, a woman program director of a rock station at a time when there just weren't any.
And I didn't realize just how good Sonny was at what Sonny did. Again, this is an FM station on a separate floor from us, so we're not hearing what they're doing, we're not relating to what they're doing. We're in our own little KFOR world on the 8th floor. But she was creating her own little dynasty there, and I say that in a very respectable way because it took a lot of foundation, it took a lot of work, it took a lot of relatability. They found themselves being able to identify with the university and the university crowd. Their music matched that, their personality matched that. Not right away, but with consistency and good programming and good humor and talented people, Sonny turned that station into what is now a huge monster, and other people have taken the path that Sonny started. But she created the morning show. It was called The Donut Holes, and they had different personalities. They would put themselves out into the community. They would get on the phone and do bits. So creative, and that's what radio was and still is to a lesser extent, but it was so freeform and so creative, and KFRX really didn't get the props from us that it deserved at the time, and I'm very quickly to admit that now, and Sonny is one of the reasons why. She was able to see into the future what needed to be done for that radio station.
And did it, and has built a heritage radio station, even though she hasn't been there for quite a few years.
Yeah.
Let's talk about news at KFOR. It's always been a radio station that's important, influential in the Lincoln community. How much of that fell on your shoulders to maintain that influence, that importance, and how did you accept that?
My philosophy isn't so much to dictate as it is to be an example of fairness. And I think I get this from my rural Nebraska, Swedish, hardworking grandfather and father on the farm. You give your word and you stick to your word. And you do your best every single time. And you are fair to people. When I started in '85, Lincoln was fewer than 200,000 people, and it wasn't unusual to see Bob Carey at Super Saver or the mayor at Super Saver. And the last thing I wanted to do was to have them remember an interview I did and have them throw a can of beans at me or something that would isolate me from ever having to have a relationship from them again. Doesn't mean I was soft, no. It just meant I was fair. It meant that I didn't go into a conversation or a setting with an agenda. I would like certain answers back, answers to questions, but I never went with an agenda, and I always conveyed, and still do, to keep things in context, to make it relatable, and to not put words in people's mouth by twisting, and the term now is the fake news, and to become one of those outlets, and to be relatable to listeners. The bottom line is the listeners. Scott Young told me once, I was so proud. I'd been working days to line up an interview, and the interview came in about 2 minutes before I was to go on the air, and I'm in this conversation, and I'm thinking, this is going to be great for the morning show, and I was late to get on the air. I was late to get on the air, and it reflected badly on Scott, and it reflected badly on KFOR, and he walked in and he says, the listeners don't care that it took you 2 days to line up an interview with this guy. All they know is that they had dead air at 7 o'clock when their alarm clock went off. That's how they thought of KFOR at 7 o'clock this morning. And I've never forgotten that, because that's right. And so I keep the listener in mind all the time, try to be relatable to what they're doing. We're very strong on weather. We're very strong on local sports. We're very strong on trying to deal in pocketbook issues in a relatable way. We're an agricultural state, so how do we relate agriculture to an urban audience? We talk about pocketbooks. We talk about how it's going to impact budgets. We try to put ourselves, we turn the mirror around and try to become that listener that's listening to us. But the bottom line, Neil, is fairness. And that sounds simple. It really does, but it's not easy to do at times in this business. We all have our biases and we all have our feelings, but I would like to think that if someone listened to KFOR over a period of time, you couldn't tell if we're pro-life, you couldn't tell if we are pro-death penalty, you can't tell if we're Republican, you can't tell if we're Democrat, what political party we are. You can't tell over a period of time, because we try to offer you balance that has served us well over the years.
Well, Lincoln really is kind of a small town when you get down right to it, and people notice those things, especially people that stay with you for decades.
And we have what could be termed small town or small market features on the, we still do birthdays. We still do birthdays at 7:25 in the morning. We used to have a KFOR Lucky Day calendar. For decades, we would print a calendar.
Dick Chapin still thinks of that very highly.
And regrets us having to stop doing it. It was for printing costs. Just wasn't economically feasible anymore. But for decades, people would get a Lucky Day calendar in the mail, and each calendar had a number. And people would hang it on their walls in their kitchen, in their office. They would even carry it with them in their car. And so we would, several times a day, call out the KFOR Lucky Day calendar number, and if that was your number, you would get a $25 in cash and $25 from Schaefer's, $25 from Russ's, $25 from a business. And we generated revenue from this Lucky Day calendar year after year after year. That was one of our franchises. We had the bridal fair, the bridal at Pershing Center, Pershing Auditorium, at the time when they weren't doing bridal fairs. Now everybody does a bridal fair.
And homemakers shows, all those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Lawn and garden shows, art fairs, flea markets, those sorts of things.
Radio stations have pretty much gotten out of that business.
They have. It's labor intensive. There isn't a lot of money generated from it.
It's expensive.
Time commitment. It's expensive. But at the time we had these franchises that Roger would foster and had the sales staff, the knowledge and the ability to be able to sell, and they were generating revenue year after year after year. And people became accustomed to this, and that was the small town in a big market. And consultants have a dickens of a time trying to program us because they can't. We can't be compared to Cleveland, Miami, Chicago, Seattle, any market. Let's pick Madison, Wisconsin's a peer city. Des Moines' a peer city. You can't relate KFOR. It's not consultable, to use an awkward term, because they've never seen anything like it.
You can't take KFOR and put it in another town and expect it to be successful.
No, it would fail in another city.
A news talk station that plays music.
Now we have gone away from music, but there was that hybrid that we created for ourselves, and it worked. For years it worked.
With regard to the news operation at KFOR, I don't know whether it's fortunate or a skill of yours, but you've assembled a team that rivals any in the state, possibly in the Midwest.
We added up the years of experience. Charlie has over 40.
Charlie Brogan.
Charlie Brogan has over 40 in radio. I have 33 at KFOR, and I have about 44 total in the business. Jeff Moats has been at KFOR and in the business for, I believe, 15 years. So you do the math, and we're looking at about 90 years of experience between the three of us. A three-person news department these days is a pretty good sized news department, not only in the state of Nebraska, but in states larger than Nebraska, to have 3 full-time people. And with that much experience is even more rare.
Well, people don't realize the experience that Charlie Brogan brings to the table.
He's managed. He's managed, he's sold.
He's been
done
in
news.
Washington, D.C. at WRC.
Worked at NBC. Worked at NBC.
He's actually been there and done it. Mm-hmm. And now he's doing your news at KFOR. Jeff Moats has done it all.
And his knowledge of sports is amazing. Again, that man has forgotten more than I will ever know about Lincoln sports, and he can just pull it up. And I draw on these people. I find myself, and I'm human, and I will find myself being a little more liberal maybe in a story that I write, and I will recognize that, and I'll go to Charlie and I'll say, Charlie, read this. What is your impression of this? Is this written fairly? And he'll honestly tell me. I'll go to Jeff. Jeff, I want to use this word. It seems a little slanted to me. What do you think? Is it acceptable? And he'll say, yeah, I don't feel comfortable, and he'll give me a suggested word. And we do this in our newsroom all the time. And it's just little nuggets, it's little moments of self-correction. And I think that serves us too. Again, back to what I said, you can listen for a duration of time. You can't tell if we're Republican or Democrat. You may hear a story that sort of gives you that impression, but if you listen for a long enough period of time, we will do our best to have our due diligence and get the other side.
Especially with regard to wire copy that comes in off the Associated Press, or even stories that maybe Jeff or Charlie have written. You rewrite everything you read on the air, don't you?
I'm into the radio station at 3:45 every morning, and go on the air at 5. And the reason I'm in that early is because I rewrite everything. I rewrite it the way I would read it.
And how is that?
My style is very conversational. And I use my hands. I'm using my hands here today, and that's the way I talk on the air, is with my hands. But I write in sentence fragments. I write with contractions. I write in a style that I try to break a mold if I detect that I am in a mold on a treadmill. In other words, what I'll do is I'll write a short sentence, 3 sentences. Boom, I'm into a 3-second actuality. Boom, I'm into a 2-second out of the actuality. I force the listener to listen. They hear that 3-second cut. Yeah, the pit bull bit the owner 5 times, and that's the cut. Well, that gets your attention. Now I'm going to tell you what happened after that cut. Maybe I'll do double cuts. Maybe I'll just do a cold audio piece right out of the sounder. But if I find myself getting into a pattern, I change it up. And I write for me. Jeff writes for himself. Charlie writes for himself. We all have our style that fits our format, and it's a fast-moving format. I try to get in between 6 and 8 stories in about 2.5 minutes with tape, with at least 2 or 3. And I'm getting into the weeds here, I'm sorry. But this is the thing that if you heard the product, you wouldn't break a sweat listening to it. It's not that fast. But it's a pace that we've generated.
Sounds a little like the Walt Kavanaugh School of Broadcast Journalism.
Going back to the Walt, again, I went to school at KFAB, and so much of what I picked up there comes out not only in the way I convey news on the air and the way I treat listeners, but the way I treat employees too. Walt could have been anyone's grandfather. He was gentle, he was professional, and you drew on his demeanor. He didn't have to beat you over the head with something that you did wrong. He would just, oh, by the way, that town in Iowa is pronounced blah, and away he would go. That's the way he would offer correction.
And he didn't have to.
No, he didn't have to.
He could have been dictatorial, but he wasn't.
No. And again, I'm a newbie. I'm a young kid.
It's really hard to talk about KFOR radio in Lincoln without talking about words like Crystal and Marconi, the 2 biggest awards the industry gives. And KFOR has won multiples of those.
Kathy Blythe has won 2 Marconis. Kathy, who was one of the first women in this business, who came from the receptionist desk to hosting a morning show to doing a problems and solutions show of 25 years, has 2 Marconis at home. Ward Jacobson, who was her co-host at the time, has a Marconi. There was a point in time at KFOR where the morning show had 3 Marconis. To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, people will Google this to find out, Paul Harvey and Larry King are the only other broadcasters that have 2 Marconis. Now I'd like, go ahead and search that, and if I'm wrong, great, someone needs to tell me. But that's rare air.
And you're up for a Crystal Award again this year.
We're up for a Crystal. We've been a finalist in the Crystal. We've won it, I want to say 4 times, Neil.
I believe you're right.
And other stations around the country have also won 4. No one has ever won 5. We are now a finalist again in 2017, 2018. And if we do get it, we would be, and again, Google this, the only station to have received 5 Crystal Awards. Crystal Awards, it combines a lot of things together. It combines your community commitment as a radio station. It also combines the community involvement of individuals that work for all your stations in your cluster in that market.
And it's tough to win.
It's really tough to
It's not easy.
A lot of stations are doing what we do at a high level in large markets
And don't get crystals.
and don't get it.
Take me back to one of the seminal events that we've all experienced and how it impacted you was 9/11. Let's talk about that.
On the air when that happened, we had a small television in the stand-up booth for news, and I saw the first plane, probably CNN, ABC, first plane go into the tower. And we have the sound down, so all we're able to see is just the picture. Ward and Kathy are on the air at the time. They turn up the sound so they know what's going on. We bring up the ABC source and we leave it there for the rest of the day. And we watch the second plane hit, and the newsroom starts to fill up. The only time I've ever seen the newsroom fill to that extent was the Challenger explosion, where people walked in and just watched it over and over again and couldn't believe what they were seeing. So we left it up to ABC for that entire day. And then we followed it. There were Nebraskans, people with Nebraska ties, so we follow it for what seemed like forever. Fast forward 10 years. I'm in Washington, D.C. Three Eagles at the time, Gary Buchanan, sent me to observe the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Set us up in a hotel across the street from Ground Zero on one of the floors where I could look out onto the memorial. And we spent 4 hours live on a Sunday, the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I had prepared interviews. I had ABC helping me. They lined up interview guests for me, and they would bring them into the hotel suite, and I would interview them on the air. Some on the phone. A producer back at the radio station would air some of the conversations and shows that I had prepared ahead of time. One that comes to mind, Neil, is a New York cop. ABC brought a New York cop in. And he sits down, and he looks like a New York cop. And he's got the accent. And I end the conversation by asking him, give me a 9/11 cop story. And he doesn't hesitate. He tells me about a co-cop of his, a friend he worked with. Let's call him Joe. He said, when you retire as a cop in New York, you walk in, you take off your badge, and you set it on a pillow on a podium, and you turn around and you walk away, and you're done. You're a civilian. You have no responsibilities left with the New York Police Department. You're done. You're retired. Joe put his badge down on the pillow, and he turned around and walked out. And the first plane hit. Joe turned around, grabbed his badge, put it back on, and died in the tower. And this cop is a Marine. And there wasn't a dry eye in that room. And that was 9/11. 10 years later, you got a room full of people that are still tearing up because of what happened 10 years ago at this very spot. And it meant that day, doing that story, covering it the way we did, made a bigger impact on me because I was there than the actual event did 10 years earlier. And it was such a privilege to be able to have a brief conversation with this man and to hear him tell that and share that story.
And to bring that story back to Lincoln.
Yeah, and to be part of our coverage on KFOR that morning.
I'd asked you about who was your most memorable interview. You came up with a couple of names, but not the big names that one would expect. Mostly local Lincoln people and state people.
I inherited Lincoln Live from Ward Jacobson, who inherited it from Kathy and Scott. It's a conversation. It's at the time it was a half hour. We've reduced it down to about 15 minutes. But it's city leaders, it's authors, it's anybody who's interesting. And you're right, the conversations that come to my mind are conversations with ordinary people. One that comes to mind is a conversation I had with John Harris, who was an entrepreneur, a former professor at the university, now has his own encouragement business. Jose Soto, for the longest time, was working in the Hispanic community. Sat them down and we talked about racism.
In Lincoln.
In Lincoln. And John related a story, and Jose echoed it, about in a grocery store, they're checking out, and the clerk, in handing back change to the white person ahead of John, hands the change back and puts it in the customer's hand. John gets up, pays for it, the clerk puts the money on the counter. To a white kid from central Nebraska, that made such a huge impact on me, to be treated this way. Jose would convey the same types of stories. People would cross the street to keep from walking in Jose's path. To be treated differently, 97% of our DNA is all the same. The only difference is color. And to be treated differently like that, to me, it was an amazing story. And those are the kinds of stories. I interviewed a judge. Judges usually aren't very good interviews. Not because of their personalities, but because they keep things, it's legal. I interviewed Warren Erbaum, who wrote a book. And he's from Atlanta, about 7 miles from my hometown. And he was an earth mover. He drove heavy equipment, and so did my grandfather, and so did I. I brought that up before the interview about his book ever even started, and I had him right where I wanted him in about 45 seconds, because we talked about something that wasn't legal, it wasn't a judge-type question, it wasn't even a book question, it had nothing to do with his book.
And first time he'd been asked that.
The first time he'd been asked that. And so those are the kinds of relationships that I like to bring out.
And then KFOR sends you to Cuba.
Governor Heinemann initiates a trade trip in August of 2005, and we work very hard at being a media representative. I'm thinking World Herald's going, Journal Star's going, Associated Press. We're going to have everybody that wants to go to this. This hasn't happened in my lifetime that I can recall. And you've got to fill out the paperwork, and you need your shots, and you've got to go through a lot of process. I was the only one to go. I was the only one that went through the process. There were no newspapers, no television, no wire services. I was the only media to go. And the governor early on said, "You will come where we go. We won't go into a room somewhere and you'll be out here. If we're in a room, you're with us." So I had full access to everything. I had full access to negotiations. I had full access to, the only exception was on the last day, it wasn't going well. Nebraska was trying to sell beans, northern beans, Great Western beans, to Cuba. And Cuba was asking for some other Nebraska products too, and it wasn't going very well. Cuba wanted to lowball, and the representatives weren't going to have anything. The governor walked into a room by himself with another Cuban representative. We were not allowed in, came back, and he announced that the deal had been made. He basically said, "I'm not going to allow you to lowball. We didn't come here to get screwed." Those are my words, not his. But that's not why we're here. We're fair, and we will offer you a fair deal. And they blinked.
What was your impressions of President Castro?
Once the deal was done, the hands were shaken, and it was official, there was rumor that we would be meeting the delegation would be meeting with Castro. So every event we thought, well, maybe this is it, maybe this is it, maybe this is it. So when the deal was done, we were allowed to roam Havana, whatever we wanted to do. So we became tourists. And I'm with some other representatives from the wheat board and some of the other grains, the soybean board, and we're out being tourists. And we get a phone call saying, get back to the hotel now. So the tour guide takes us, and we're running red lights. We're going as fast as we want to go. We get there, we change, and the guy says, you got 5 minutes. Change, be on this bus in 5 minutes. So we change, get back on the bus again. Now we're escorted. Now we've got some security cars in front of us. And
Did you know where you were going?
We had no idea where we were going. We assumed, but we had been assuming up to this point we had been wrong. Turn a corner, and there's the palace where Castro is. And so we get out of the van, and the only thing they ask is, do you have a camera? I said, yes. I handed them my camera, and we walked in. And we get there. The group that I'm with were late, terribly late.
And Heineman's with you?
No, the governor's there. They've stayed at the hotel. They have heard that they need to be there. We barely get there. We stand in line, and then in walks Fidel Castro. And he shakes the governor's hand. He shakes Greg Ibaugh's hand, the state ag director. He starts shaking hands. And we have our name tags. And he gets over to me, and he sees Dale Johnson, KFOR. And he looks at me, and he goes, CNN. And he pokes his hand up in there, and he goes, CNN. No, sir, I'm not with CNN. No, I don't know Spanish, and I was just being gracious and polite. And then he moves on down the line. From there, we go into this room. It's a huge conference room with a table that looks like a runway. It's huge. And we stand at our chairs. Fidel comes walking in, and he stands, and we're all waiting to be seated. He never sits down. For 4 hours, he talks. He talks about hospital. He talks about schools. He talks about Venezuela. He talks about oil. He sends one of his assistants into a room, and the assistant comes back with a rice cooker. And his point of this was he wanted to make sure that every Cuban had a rice cooker so that they would never starve. They always would have rice. Send another assistant back in, came back with a piece of tile. And his point to this was, we are going to make every house hurricane-proof. And this was a method by which his goal was to do this. Had a map, had someone bring out a map. And it was all of these branch hospitals located around Havana and around Cuba. Not large hospitals, but small neighborhood-type medical facilities, and how medical was free and how education was free. They were sending doctors to Venezuela. People were getting their education. Venezuelans were coming to Cuba, and there was this exchange. For 4 hours, we stood.
Did you ask any questions?
No. The only conversation was between Castro and the governor. Castro and the governor. They were on each side of the table. And for 4 hours, we stood and listened to Fidel. I know he knows English, but not a single English from his lips, all from a translator. And the translator then had to translate from the governor into Spanish. It was absolutely amazing. And he was great health. This was before he became ill in health. Starch suit, not a single wrinkle in that uniform. It could have stood in a corner by itself. He didn't even need to wear it. It was so stiff, but the man just had so much propaganda flow from his lips. He just couldn't help it. A 4-hour speech was probably an abbreviated version of what he's used to saying.
Dale Johnson has had a tremendous career in radio, and you've done it all, seen it all. And that would have been enough for most people. But then you had something else happen. Changed your life.
Yes, it did. I am not the same person that I was March 20th of 2016. My brother and I are planning a trip to Sturgis. We're going to the motorcycle rally. It's on our bucket list. So I have a new motorcycle for me, and I wanted to get as much riding in as I could. It's the first day of spring. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I go to the grocery store. 16-year-old doesn't see me and turns into my bike and hits my left leg. And I try to keep the bike up. I hit the curb. I fly off about 21 feet, and I land, and I break my shoulder and bruise some ribs, everything on the left side. And I'm lying there, and I want to make sure the 16-year-old doesn't drive, or the driver didn't know he was 16, but the driver, so he doesn't drive off. So I'm lying here, and I span to make sure that the car is still there, which it is. And as I make that span both to the car and back, I see the sole of my shoe, of my left leg, and my jeans are purple. And so I knew right then and there that I'd lost my leg. It's still attached, but I'd lost my leg. It was broken 7 places from the knee to the ankle. No circulation when the ambulance got there. But I knew that if I passed out, I'd be worthless to people. So I intentionally willed myself to stay conscious, and I rattled off my name, my address, my phone number. My wife's name, her address, her phone number. My son's name, address, and phone number. And then I circled back around and did it again. I wanted to be helpful to people who could maybe be helpful to me, and make some phone calls, get a hold of, and it worked, because one of the people there called my wife. People called 911, but someone who heard me give out my wife's name and phone number called her, and she met us at the hospital. Now, eventually she would have been notified, but someone there heard what I had to say. The last thing I remember, they put the boards under my back, and they started to cut my leather jackets. Kind of a cool day. I had 2 jackets on, both leather. And I told the paramedic, I said, please, no, not my jackets, don't cut my jackets. And then I don't remember anymore until I woke up in ICU. Learned later that I had a 7% chance of survival. Out of 100 of these crashes, 93 people die. I was losing as much blood as they were putting into me. Our bodies have about 11 units of blood. They put 27 into me. That's almost 3 times what the body holds. They were putting a unit in about every 3 minutes because it just wasn't. And my heart was trying to keep me alive. They called in a cardiologist because my heart rate was just doing everything that it could to keep me alive. Learned later there was a chaplain in the room. I was at a point where they didn't know whether I would live. Got me stable, kept me in ICU. Second day I wake up, my wife is there, I look at her, she shakes her head, I look at my leg, and we start to cry. And that's where my life changed. And I asked the nurse, I says, how can I get out of this bed? Second day in ICU, how can I get out of this bed? Let's find a way for me to move. So with all the things plugged into me, they rig up a device where I can stand up and hop, and they want me to go a quarter of a way down ICU and a quarter way back. And I said, we're going to go all the way around. So we circled ICU, and then I said, let's go around again. And she knew better. She knew me better than I knew myself at that time, so once was enough. I was in ICU for 3 days, went to a room, a physical therapist walked in, and I'm doing sit-ups. My left arm is broken, and my ribs, it hurts. But I knew in order to be functional, in order to operate without a leg, I had to be stronger in my core. And I'm not an exercise guy. I didn't exercise, didn't yoga, didn't do anything, but I knew that in order for me to be of benefit to people, to get out of here as quickly as I could, to get my life back to the place where it was, I needed to make improvements now. I needed to start now, get motivated now. So I hit physical therapy 2 and 3 times a day, would do sit-ups in my bed. I'd hook my feet around the base of the hospital bed so that I could pull myself up to do some exercises. Was in the hospital for 11 days. 3 months after the crash, first day of spring, fast forward 3 months to the first day of summer, I went back to work. Went back to work in a wheelchair, but I went back to work. Fast forward another 2.5 months, we had planned a trip to Peru with my stepdaughter, my wife's daughter, and her husband, who is from Peru. We were going back for some family fun. So we had planned this trip to Peru for about 5.5, 6 months, March to first week of September. I'm climbing Machu Picchu. And we're climbing Inca ruins in Machu Picchu. And you don't tell yourself you can't do it, because then you can't. So you tell yourself you're gonna do it. You wake up in the morning and you look at your schedule. Today we're gonna climb this mountain. Today we're gonna walk this trail. And nothing is short and nothing is smooth. Everything's undulated and old and ancient. And it was a challenge every step. But it was the best thing that I could possibly do for myself at that time. I didn't go to Sturgis in 2016. Got another bike. I'm riding it. And my brother and I are planning Sturgis this August. So we're going to go.
It'll be a special trip.
And let me just say, this is I say this and I get the looks from people. Neil, this is probably one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And that just sounds so strange because what it has done is it is a Vesuvius of gratefulness that I have. I'm grateful to be talking to you today. I'm grateful to be recognized by my peers in a business that is so creative and so volatile and so transient. I'm grateful that I have a vehicle that got me to Omaha and can get me back. I have a wife that I can go home to. It's possible, it's very possible, it's more probable than possible that you would have had to have interviewed me in a hospital bed in my living room. And I may not even have been able to recognize you. The chances are greater for me to have been that person than it would be to be the person that's sitting here privileged to be able to talk about my career with you.
You did mention who was one of the first persons to call you after the accident and how much it meant to you.
Brian Gallagher. And I've told this to Brian. I said, Brian, I don't even remember you being there. I was on so many meds and I was so heavily sedated, but Brian Gallagher was the first one there. Brian Gallagher, my co-host at KRGI in Grand Island. What a guy. What a guy to drop what he's doing. We hadn't seen each other in decades. He moved to Lincoln shortly to do some marketing work with a car dealership. And then we met, I think, once. But when I left KRGI in '85, maybe once, maybe twice, we'd seen each other. And this man picked it up where we left off and drove to Lincoln and was the first person to see me in ICU. And it means the world to me. That man, he will have his spot one of these days in the Nebraska broadcasters' hierarchy.
You also got some advice from someone else who could easily relate to what you went through, former governor.
Bob Kerrey, again, one of my favorite governors to cover, called me. He was one of the first three to five phone calls in the hospital. And during the course of the conversation, he offered 3 words to me that I have never forgotten and will never forget, and use them often in the presentations that I am privileged to give. Do not settle. Do not settle for a prosthetic that's good enough, because you can. You can be satisfied with what you have. Don't be satisfied with your gait. Don't be satisfied with the way you walk. Work at getting better. Don't be satisfied where you are in life and what the circumstances are in your life. Push it. Push it. If you find yourself going down that rabbit hole, allow yourself license. Give yourself license to be able to go there, because out the other side is the brightest light and the best outcome. And he has been right every single time. I've gone down these and had these pity parties for myself. They were longer early on. I don't have them anymore. But you come out the other side and someone brings you a pie. Someone visits you. You get a letter with $5 in it, a card from somebody you haven't seen in 30 years. You get a visit at the front door. You get a stranger who gives you a call. You get something out of it at the other end. And I've had an opportunity to thank Bob over and over again for offering me those words, do not settle. And it has served me so well. Because Bob, being an amputee, lost his foot at about the ankle in the war as a Navy SEAL, the Vietnam War.
Certainly could relate to you. Mm-hmm. Probably not the last time we will hear from our guest today, Dale Johnson. Dale is the news director of Alpha Media's KFOR Radio in Lincoln. Dale, thanks so much for the time and the opportunity tonight. Appreciate it.
I'm grateful that you asked me.
This has been a production of UNO Television for the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project.